Mark Rivers stood on the cracked concrete of what used to be Denver's main square, shielding his eyes as the alien warships blocked out the sun. The hum of their engines filled the air like the roar of an approaching storm. People scattered, screaming, but there was nowhere left to run. Earth had fallen months ago. Mark clenched his fists. His uniform was torn, the insignia of Earth's resistance barely visible through the grime and bloodstains. He had fought until the last stronghold crumbled, but fighting didn't matter anymore. The Caliph had won. The alien conquerors emerged from their ships in orderly columns, giant figures towering over the humans they had defeated. Their black armor gleamed like polished obsidian, etched with glowing red lines that pulsed in rhythm with their heavy footsteps. Helmets with slit visors obscured their faces, making them seem more machine than living creature. Mark's gaze locked onto one of them. This Caliph stood taller than the rest, nearly 10 feet of rippling muscle encased in jagged armor. Silver streaks lined his chest plate, marking him as something more than just a foot soldier. The others moved around him with deference, confirming Mark's suspicion. This one was in charge. Mark didn't know why he stared. Maybe it was the way the alien carried himself, calm, almost detached, as if all the death and destruction didn't faze him. Or maybe it was because Mark had lost everything and no longer cared what happened next. The Caliph warrior turned, and Mark felt those glowing crimson eyes settle on him. For a moment, everything else faded. The ruins, the prisoners, the guards barking orders. It was just Mark and the alien, staring each other down. Then the moment passed, and the Caliph moved on. Days blurred into weeks. The survivors were herded into labor camps, forced to rebuild Earth cities under Caliph rule. Mark found himself clearing rubble in the shadow of crumbled skyscrapers. The Caliph didn't speak to them except to issue commands, and most humans didn't dare look their captors in the eye. But Mark kept watching. The alien leader, the one with silver streaks on his armor, was never far. Unlike the others, he didn't shout or lash out when prisoners slowed down. He just stood, observing, like a predator biding its time. Mark didn't know what possessed him to speak that day. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the way the alien kept watching him, as if waiting for something. "You gonna stand there all day?" Mark called out, his voice sharp against the silence. "Or are you actually in charge?" Gasps rippled through the work line. Several prisoners froze, their eyes wide with terror. One of the Caliph guards snapped toward Mark, raising a crackling energy whip. But the alien leader lifted a hand. The guard stopped instantly, lowering his weapon. Mark felt his heart hammering in his chest as the alien approached. Up close, the Caliph was even more imposing. The black armor looked alive, shifting slightly as if it could change shape at will. The alien's helmet retracted, revealing a face that was eerily humanoid, a strong jawline, narrow nose, and deep crimson eyes that glowed faintly in the shadows. Bold words, the alien rumbled, his voice like distant thunder. For a creature that is already broken, Mark swallowed hard but didn't back down. "Yeah, well, you're the one staring like you've never seen a human before. Got a problem." The other prisoners looked like they wanted to crawl into the ground. Even the guard stiffened, as if expecting the alien leader to snap Mark in half. But instead, the alien tilted his head. "I like you, human," he said at last. "You have fire. What is your name?" Mark blinked. Was this a trick? No Caliph had ever asked for a human's name. "Mark Rivers," he said cautiously. The alien gave a slow nod. "I am Therax." Mark didn't expect Therax to remember his name. But the next day, the alien warrior sought him out again. "You are different," Therax said as Mark shoveled debris into a pile. Mark paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "Is that a compliment?" "It is an observation," Therax replied. "Most humans accept their defeat. You do not." Mark scowled. "What do you expect? You invaded our planet, killed millions, took everything we had." Therax didn't flinch. "And yet you continue to defy us. Because someone has to." Therax studied him for a moment. Your people call us monsters, he said finally. Do you believe that? Mark wanted to say yes, but the words caught in his throat. Looking at Therax up close, Mark saw something he hadn't noticed before, a weariness behind those glowing eyes. I don't know what I believe, Mark admitted, but I know I'm not afraid of you. Therax's mouth twitched, just barely. You should be. As the days stretched into weeks, Mark found himself drawn to the alien warrior. They spoke in brief exchanges, always careful not to draw too much attention. Therax never acted cruelly toward the prisoners, and Mark began to see cracks in the Kael'thas's image of invincibility. One night, as Mark prepared to sleep, Therax approached him in the shadows. Why do you fight? Therax asked. Mark sat up, surprised by the question. Because we had no choice? Therax's crimson eyes narrowed. We Kael'th fight because it is our way. Conquest is survival. Mark shook his head. No, it's destruction. Therax said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Their conversations grew longer. Therax admitted he had fought in countless wars across the galaxy, conquering one world after another. But there was no pride in his voice, only exhaustion. Mark saw an opening. What if there's more than just war? Mark asked one night. Therax stared at him. Peace is weakness. No. Peace is strength. It's choosing not to fight even when you can. Therax looked away, but Mark knew the words had struck a chord. It wasn't long before their growing bond drew attention. The other Kael'th whispered, and the guards began watching Mark more closely. You are in danger, Therax warned. So are you, Mark shot back. Why are you risking this? Therax didn't answer, but Mark saw something in his eyes. Doubt. Maybe even guilt. They'll turn on you, Mark said softly. Therax met his gaze. Let them. And with those words, the course of their fates began to shift. Mark knew he had crossed a line. His conversations with Therax had gone from brief exchanges to dangerous confidences, and the other Kael'th had begun to notice. Guards lingered near him during work hours now, their red eyes watching his every move. The prisoners noticed, too, whispering behind their hands and casting him wary glances. No one spoke to him anymore, not because they didn't want to, but because they were afraid that whatever strange connection he had with the alien warrior would bring trouble down on all of them. And Mark couldn't blame them. He was afraid, too, but he wasn't about to stop. Therax was more than a towering symbol of Kael'th dominance. Beneath the armor and glowing eyes, Mark had glimpsed something unexpected: doubt, regret, even a spark of defiance. And Mark clung to that spark, like a drowning man grasping for a rope. If he could convince Therax to see things differently, then maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to fight back. The confrontation came sooner than Mark expected. It was late evening when the guards pulled him from the work line, dragging him to the central square where the Kael'th officers stood in formation. Therax was there, but his silver-marked armor was gone, replaced by simple black plating. Mark's stomach dropped. He knew enough about Kael'th culture by now to understand what that meant. Therax had been stripped of his rank. The Kael'th commander, a hulking brute with jagged horns protruding from his helmet, addressed the gathered prisoners in the Kael'th tongue, his voice booming across the square. Mark didn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. The meaning was clear when the commander pointed at Therax, then at Mark. Therax, Mark whispered. What's going on? Therax's voice was low and strained. They see me as weak, corrupted by your influence. Mark's heart pounded. What does that mean? Therax turned to face him, crimson eyes glowing faintly. They want proof of my loyalty. And then Mark understood. The Kael'th wanted Therax to kill him. The guards shoved Mark forward, forcing him to his knees. The commander handed Therax a weapon, a long blade with an edge that pulsed red-hot. Don't do this, Mark said, his voice steady even as his hands trembled. Therax stood frozen, his massive form towering over Mark. The other Kael'th watched in silence, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. Therax, Mark said softly. You're not like them. You know this isn't right. The Kalatha's grip tightened on the blade, the glow reflecting off his black armor. For a long, terrible moment, Mark thought he might actually do it. Then Therax threw the weapon to the ground. The sound of it clattering against the stone echoed through the square. No, Therax said, his voice like thunder. I will not. Chaos erupted. The commander roared, lunging at Therax with his own blade. Therax caught the blow with his bare hands, snapping the blade in half with a deafening crack. Run! Therax shouted at Mark, but Mark didn't run. He couldn't leave Therax to face the Kalatha alone. Instead, he grabbed the fallen blade and drove it into the nearest guard, knocking the alien back. The prisoners saw their chance. Fueled by desperation, they surged forward, overwhelming the Kalath guards with numbers and raw fury. Mark fought beside Therax, wielding the alien blade like a club. The Kalath were stronger, but the humans were faster and more determined. For the first time since the invasion, they had hope. By the time the battle ended, the square was littered with bodies, Kalath and human alike. The surviving prisoners stared at Therax, unsure whether to cheer or flee. Mark stepped forward, wiping blood from his face. He's with us, he said firmly. Some of the prisoners nodded, but others looked skeptical. He's one of them, a woman said. How do we know we can trust him? Mark glanced at Therax, who stood silently, his massive frame casting a shadow over the crowd. Because he just risked everything to save me, Mark said. And because we don't have a choice? The escape was brutal. Therax led them through the ruins, using Kalath tactics to avoid patrols and ambushes. At first, the prisoners kept their distance from him, but as the days passed, they began to see him as more than just an alien. Therax taught them how to fight, how to use Kalath weapons, how to predict patrol routes, how to move without being seen. Mark saw the change in the group as fear gave way to determination. But Therax also changed. He spoke more openly, asking questions about human culture and history. He listened when the prisoners told stories about their families and lives before the war. And slowly, the walls between them began to crumble. One night, as they rested in an abandoned warehouse, Therax sat beside Mark, his crimson eyes dim in the flickering firelight. You were right, Therax said quietly. Mark frowned. About what? Peace, Therax said. It is strength. Mark felt a lump rise in his throat. I didn't think you'd ever say that. Therax's gaze hardened. I cannot undo what my people have done, but I can fight to make it right. Mark nodded. Then let's make them regret ever coming here. Their first strike came a week later. Using stolen Kalath weapons, they ambushed a patrol convoy, freeing dozens of prisoners and stealing supplies. Word spread quickly, humans fighting back with the help of a Kalath defector. The Kalath commanders branded Therax a traitor and put a bounty on his head. But instead of breaking the resistance, it united them. Mark and Therax became symbols of defiance, the man and the alien who stood together against impossible odds. And as the rebellion grew, Mark began to believe that they might actually win. But victory would not come easily. The Kalath brought reinforcements, tightening their grip on the cities. Supplies dwindled, and tensions rose within the resistance. Some humans still didn't trust Therax, and fractures began to form. Mark knew the hardest battles were yet to come. But as he stood beside Therax, watching their fighters prepare for the next raid, he also knew one thing for certain. They weren't going down without a fight. The resistance was growing, but so was the Kalatha's fury. Weeks after their first victory, Mark stood atop a crumbling rooftop, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Fires burned in the distance, and the faint hum of Kalath warships patrolling the skies rattled his bones. We can't keep this up, said Lena, a former medic who had become his second-in-command. She stood beside him, her arms crossed tightly against the cold. They're closing in. Mark didn't answer. He knew she was right. Supplies were running low. Half their fighters were wounded. The Caliph had doubled their patrols and sealed off entire sectors of the city. But it wasn't just the Caliph forces closing in. Mark glanced down at the crowd below. Survivors, fighters, and scavengers huddled around makeshift fires. They looked at Therax with a mix of awe and fear. No matter what Therax did, no matter how many battles he won for them, some of the humans still didn't trust him. "They'll turn on him eventually," Lena said, echoing Mark's thoughts. "You know that, right?" Mark clenched his jaw. "Not if we win first." The attack came at dawn. A Caliph strike force swept into their camp, firing energy blasts that tore through stone and steel. Chaos erupted as humans scattered, grabbing weapons and scrambling for cover. Mark grabbed his rifle and fired back, but the Caliph's armor was too strong. The aliens moved in formation, herding the resistance fighters like cattle. "Mark!" Therax's voice boomed over the chaos. The alien warrior charged through the fray, his massive blade cutting down enemies with brutal efficiency. Blood splattered his black armor, but he didn't slow. "We have to fall back," Mark shouted. "No," Therax roared, his crimson eyes blazing. "We fight." Mark hesitated, torn between retreat and defiance. Then he saw Lena go down, a Caliph spear piercing her shoulder. "Cover me," Mark shouted. He sprinted through the debris, dodging blasts and rubble. He reached Lena and dragged her behind a collapsed wall as Therax held the Caliph at bay. "This is bad," Lena gasped, clutching her wound. Mark pressed down on the bleeding. "You're not dying here. Stay with me." "Mark!" Therax bellowed. Mark turned, and his heart dropped. A Caliph commander, taller and more heavily armored than the rest, stepped into the clearing. He carried a massive war hammer, crackling with energy. Therax moved to intercept, but the commander swung with inhuman speed, knocking Therax backward. "No!" Mark yelled. Therax staggered to his feet, but the blow had dented his armor. Blood trickled down his side. "You cannot win, traitor," the commander growled. Therax's jaw tightened. "I do not fight to win. I fight to end this." Mark fired his rifle, forcing the commander back, but the Caliph's armor absorbed the shots. "We need to go," Mark shouted. Therax didn't move. He stood his ground, raising his blade. "Therax, don't do this," Mark pleaded, but Therax turned to him, his crimson eyes softer than Mark had ever seen them. "Protect them," Therax said, and then he charged. The last thing Mark saw before the smoke swallowed them was Therax, colliding with the Caliph commander, their weapons sparking as they clashed. The survivors regrouped in the tunnels beneath the city. The air was thick with smoke and sweat, and the wounded groaned softly in the dark. Mark paced restlessly, his fists clenched. "Where is he?" Lena asked, her voice weak. Mark didn't answer. He couldn't. Hours passed, but Therax never came. "He bought us time," Lena said gently. Mark shook his head. "He's not dead." "How do you know?" "Because he promised." Days turned into a week. The resistance was battered but alive, and the Caliph forces had pulled back to regroup. But Therax didn't return. Mark refused to give up. He led scouting missions deeper into the city, searching for any sign of his friend. He ignored the whispers, the doubts from the others who said Therax had betrayed them, or worse, been killed and left to rot in the ruins. Then, on the 10th day, Mark found him. Therax lay in the rubble of a collapsed tower, his armor shattered and his body covered in burns and wounds. "Therax!" Mark dropped to his knees, frantically pulling debris away. The alien's eyes flickered open. "Mark, you're alive." Mark grinned despite the tears stinging his eyes. "I could say the same about you." Therax tried to sit up, but collapsed with a groan. "Don't move," Mark said. "We're getting you out of here." Therax's massive hand gripped Mark's arm. "No, it's not over. It is for now." "No," Therax said fiercely. "The Caliph will not stop. They cannot. Their leaders will bring more ships, burn your world to ash. Unless..." Mark swallowed. Unless what? Therax's eyes burned with determination. Unless we ended at the source. The plan was insane. Therax revealed that the Caliph fleet operated under a single command structure, a high nexus that controlled their forces through a central hub. If they could destroy it, the Caliph would lose coordination, leaving their armies in chaos. But the hub was aboard the Caliph mothership orbiting Earth. "It's suicide," Lena said. Mark didn't disagree, but as he looked at Therax, broken, bleeding, but still fighting, he knew they didn't have a choice. "Then we die fighting," Mark said. The final assault was unlike anything they had attempted before. With Therax leading the charge, the Resistance infiltrated the Caliph stronghold and hijacked a transport ship. Mark sat beside Therax in the cockpit as they ascended into the sky. "If we don't come back," Mark said, "I want you to know." Therax cut him off. "We will come back." Mark smirked. "You sure about that?" Therax's crimson eyes gleamed. "No," Mark laughed, and for the first time in months, it felt real. The mothership loomed ahead, a black silhouette against the stars. Mark gripped his weapon as alarms blared, and Therax stepped forward, his blade humming with energy. "Ready?" Mark asked. Therax bared his teeth in what might have been a smile.